Hi everyone, my name is Brice. I'm really sorry I can't be there in person today, but I'm really excited to share my research. Let me just begin by sharing my screen so you all can see my PowerPoint. There we go. All right, let me make that bigger. Great. Like I said, my name is Julie Brice. I'm currently working as a research assistant at Te Huataki Waiora School of Health at Te Whare Whananga o Waikato, the University of Waikato in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And today I'll be presenting some research from my much larger project around the activewear phenomenon, particularly looking at the concept of space-time mattering in relation to gender and activewear. Before I even get going, it's really important to actually define what is activewear. When I put activewear and athleisure, those terms I in my research use interchangeably. There is some frustration with using them interchangeably or critique of using them interchangeably, but for the purposes of this research, if I use either of those words, they mean the same. And I use the Merriam-Webster Dictionary of Athleisure, which is casual clothing designed to be worn both for exercising and for general use. And so some scholars have defined activewear, the typical outfit, as kind of high-waisted leggings and crop tops on women. I broaden that really any clothing that was designed for functionality, but is often worn in and out of the gym. And it's become kind of a cultural phenomenon in a way. We're seeing it, this clothing on women's bodies in a lot of different spaces. So obviously gyms, but also cafes, grocery stores, on celebrities. It's an industry that is outpacing all other apparel industries right now, and it's an industry that's primarily targeting women. Now, there's a long history of sports and fashion dictating or impacting each other. This particular trend, I date it back to around the 2000s, as do some other scholars, with the kind of development of Lululemon. And Lululemon was founded by Chip Wilson, who actually used his background in designing snowboard clothing to design functional clothing for women's bodies. Clothing was designed not only to fit women's bodies, but allow extensive movement. And this is a little bit different. Previously, activewear companies, such larger companies, basically did the pink it and shrink it. They take the men's line, they pink it and they shrink it. And so this is a little bit different. That is specifically designed for women's bodies. And so because it has become this cultural phenomenon, there has been different sociocultural research on it. Much of this has focused critiquing kind of neoliberalism and post-feminist rhetoric and ideas that are present within the activewear industry, websites, social media, advertising, particularly looking at the ways in which there's a strong focus on individuality, on empowerment, on choice, on consumption, and as well as a critique of the ways in which the industry contributes to the production of fit femininity. What I mean by that is there's kind of within the industry this really intense focus on kind of women being thinned and toned, focusing on fitness and health. And in many ways, it contributes to this unrealistic, unattainable standard that's placed on women's bodies, particularly because of the tight-fitting nature of the clothing women's bodies become on display. And so it can reinforce these ideas of disciplining and toning female bodies. And it really is kind of creating this unrealistic standard. And I'd like to say that this critique is completely valid. It's the critiques I've made in other papers. This presentation is going to be a little bit different. It's going to move away from the critique and more at the productive capabilities of activewear and gender. And so to do that, I turned towards new materialist theory. So like I said, the purpose of this research was to use new materialist theory to think about the production of gender within activewear. First off, let me just really quickly define new materialist theory. It's a theory I've been working with for a while, and it can be hard to describe. It's basically a term for a host of theories and concepts within the post-humanist ontological turn that focuses on the vitality of matter. And so there are a range of different theories that have focused on materiality. Oftentimes, those theories see matter as being passive or something that's acted upon or given symbolic representation based upon what humans understand. This theory moves a little bit away towards that and more towards matter itself as being an active, generative, vital force. And so it's more about how humans, non-human matter interact with each other in a back and forth rather than just one acting upon the other. Therefore, there's a lot of focus on the connections between humans and non-humans. And again, it's this post-humanist theory. So it's about kind of decentering human experience. Human experience is important, but we place it in a conversation with other non-human matter and humans. There are a lot of different theorists within new materialism. Rosie Braidotti, Deleuze and Guattari usually in there, Actor Network Theory, Luc Latour, Jane Bennett. I use Karen Barad, and I've kind of gone extensively with her theory of agential realism. Now, there's not enough time in this talk to go into the theory of agential realism, but rather I'm going to highlight just one concept, and I use space-time mattering. So using space-time mattering in this project, my main research question was, how does broad space-time mattering impact understandings of the production of femininity in activewear? And does it allow for alternative away from that critique that I mentioned before? To accomplish this, I used a diffractive methodology or diffractive approach. That is a Baradian term, and unfortunately I don't have all the time to go into it, but it's basically about taking different fields of thought, different data, and reading insights through each other. So looking at the way that these ideas interfere, diverge, create these patterns. And so I pulled from a lot of different data sets for this particular project. One was bringing together, I did 22 interviews with women who were 18 or over about their experience in activewear. I looked at a range of different activewear advertising, and I also brought together historic events. So I took all these different ideas and put them with each other and with theory to read them through, see where they interfere, see their patterns of interference and divergences. And so that's really what this kind of the methodology that I employed. So I talked about new materialisms, I talked about the method. Really quickly, let me go into space-time mattering as it is central to how I'm going to think about femininity in activewear. So broad space-time mattering really questions the linearity and the singularity of time and space. They write that time is not a linear entity and neither is space reserved to physical boundaries. What they're really emphasizing, and as many scholars have, we look at indigenous scholars, we look at feminist culture geographers, we're really moving away from this fixity of time and space, right? It's not this incremental movement. It is more fluid. It's kind of constantly evolving. And so they write that the past, present, and future are not in a relation of unfolding, but threaded through one another in a nonlinear enfolding of space-time mattering, a topology that defies any suggestion of a smooth manifold. So my research, the way I'm understanding space-time mattering, and I have to say there's not extensive research with broad space-time mattering, so it's kind of my working through this really complex topic. But to me, space-time mattering was a way to re-envision the ideas of time and space, how history is never in the past, it's constantly present, it's constantly interacting. Phenomena are spread out across spatio-temporalities. And importantly, since this is a new materialist theory, there's the role of non-human matter. So it's not just time and space, but matter all play a role and they all interact in our phenomenon. There's a great quote by Ringrose and Rawlings who write that space-time mattering allows for theorizing how discursive material interactions and non-human agentic matter, such as space, objects, and even time, shape the constitution of gender. So in my research, I look at both discourses and materiality and how they interact with each other across spatio-temporalities to affect gender today within the activewear phenomenon. To do this, I look at kind of two ideas of femininity that have been present across history, that are present within the activewear phenomenon, and how activewear is actually kind of challenging some of these ideas. The first one is appearance-based femininity. So appearance-based femininity refers to a range of behaviors with which women must comply in order to signal their femininity, including cosmetics, fashion, hair dyes, fitness clubs. It's basically this idea that women are expected to value their appearance. They're expected to put time and money into shaping their appearance into socially acceptable ideas. Women become valued for their appearance, so these objects of beauty. And that's really this idea that's been around for a long time. And in some ways, activewear is challenging that. So let me explain. If you think about appearance-based femininity, think about the corsets from the Victorian era. A lot of us know how they were so tight that they restricted breathing, but they did more than that. They limited functionality. They actually made it so women were very dependent on men for movement alone. Women could not go up and down steps without a man's help. They could not walk very easily, so they often had a hard time looking for jobs or being out on the street looking for anything. They depended on a man's income in order to purchase these. And this was because women were these objects that were supposed to be viewed, admired. They were not supposed to be walking around looking for work. Now, again, this applies primarily to high-class women. It's very different for low-class women. But if we think about it, the corset itself was part of this idea of appearance-based femininity. And that's with us today. If you look at kind of the beauty industry and the beauty fitness industries have actually kind of almost exacerbated it. We see high rates of plastic surgery. We see that there's kind of makeup beyond belief for everybody to buy. So we're seeing this appearance-based femininity from the past is not in the past. It is here with us today. And so if we're thinking about how that is present within the activewear phenomenon, when I spoke to my participants, though, I got a really different idea of how important appearance was when in activewear. Nina and Jan both talked primarily about how they wear activewear not for their appearance, but for the functionality of the clothing. So Jan talked about, I don't feel conscious about how I look because I'm wearing it so I can get the most out of my workouts. Nina said that she doesn't care what people think about her because it's entirely about function. So we're saying for them, the activewear allowed them to move. It allowed them to be functional. If you look at the advertising, activewear advertising, this is an ad by Under Armour by Gina Carano, and featuring Gina Carano. And yes, you can critique it for the ways in which she embodies kind of hyper femme, cisgender, traditional ideals of beauty. But you can also think about those words that say, I'll be more than a pretty face. It's not about her being an object of beauty. It's not about her being something to be stared at. It's about her strength, about her power, about being functional. Similar, these two pictures that you see are from Lululemon's White Space, which is their research laboratory in Vancouver. And you can see it's very high tech. I had the opportunity to visit there, and it is a research lab. And what they're doing is they're designing clothes that are about function, looking at friction, looking at tension, looking at velocity, looking at stretch, sweat wicking. So there's a strong focus knowing that women are going to be functional in this clothing. So we think about space-time mattering, we're bringing it all together. And I purposely made this really messy because that's what space-time mattering does. It says these corsets, this idea of appearance-based femininity is never in the past. It is with us today. It is shaping phenomena. It is important. We can also see how activewear is about functionality. We're seeing advertisements that feature function. We're seeing women use it. And these interact in the way they're challenging and they're redefining how we understand femininity to be about functionality. This is true if we think also about this kind of historic idea of women being weak and fragile. I'm sure many of us are familiar with Patricia Bertinsky's amazing work, but she talks about the eternally wounded woman and how medical discourses in the 19th century has such an impact in how we understand women's bodies. But women were seen as these reproductive vehicles. And so therefore their bodies had to be protected and cared for. And therefore there's a lot less emphasis on strong, vigorous movement. Women were expected to kind of just walk and be very docile. And these ideas are with us, right? We have so many ideas of girls shouldn't be playing rugby, they shouldn't be playing boxing, they shouldn't be engaging in these really physical sports because it might damage their reproductive organs. And so I said, this idea is all around us, but in activewear, it's very different in some ways. This is an ad from Nike. It talks about, I have thunder thighs, and that's a compliment because they're strong, they're toned, they're muscular, they can cheer me on in marathons. And so it's about moving. It's about being strong in these marathons. It's about having that functionality and that movement component as being part of female and femininity. My participants, actually talked about how they liked wearing activewear because it showed their muscles and it showed their muscle definition. They were able to really showcase the muscular body and the strength in their bodies that they got through movement. So again, we bring it back together. The eternally wounded woman, women as being weak, women not being able to move is very contra to what we see today with activewear. And so again, Space-Time Mattering encourages to see how the materiality of activewear, the way in which it encourages movement, the advertisements, the eternally wounded woman across these spatiotemporalities all interact to produce gender. So in a way, and I really say in a way, this is just one way of thinking about it, is that activewear could be understood as redefining femininity. We see that it's not about appearance-based, but it's much more functionality-based. People are proud of their strong, moving bodies. We say femininity becomes about functionality, movement, and strength. And so I finish with the simple act of wearing leggings is not simply here now, but is always threaded through with anticipation of where it is going, but will never simply reach in a path that is yet to come. I love this idea of it's not simply here now, that we have to look across spatiotemporalities and across the matter of spatiotemporalities to really think about femininity, to think about gender. And so for me, Space-Time Mattering offered another way to think about how gender is produced and the ideas that activewear is creating about femininity and women's bodies. I think Space-Time Mattering, like I said, it's in the beginning stages of who's using it and how people are using it. But for sports historian, it does provide another way to think about the production of phenomena transcending time and space, building upon a long history of scholars who work with this. One of the key things it does offer is that it incorporates the importance of non-human matter, viewing objects as lively, vital, and important in producing ways of knowing. So, that earlier quote, it really is about looking at material discursive interactions, looking at how space, time, and matter all together interact to produce phenomenon. So I'll thank you there. If you were interested in learning a little bit more about feminist materials and my work with it and my work with my colleagues, My colleagues and I have written a chapter in the new Routledge Handbook of Sport History around how we can use new materialisms in history research. I also have published a book with Holly Thorpe and Marianne Clark about feminist new materialism, sport, and fitness. I actually have a couple copies that I'd be more than happy to post to anyone who's interested if you just want to shoot me an email. So thank you so much for listening, and hopefully I'll have some time to answer your questions.